Imagine this. You wake up on a hard wooden bench wrapped in a sheepskin. The house is dark, the walls are smoking, and someone with only 3 teeth is snoring nearby. You try to stand, and the cold hits you like a hammer, 3 degrees above freezing. It smells like fish, sweat, and yesterday's cabbage. There's no shower, no coffee, just a wooden chamber pot and a bowl of porridge laced with straw. Welcome. You're a Viking now. Romantic? Maybe. But only if you don't mind freezing, getting food poisoning, losing your teeth, or living without Google. Because a Viking wasn't a Marvel hero. He was a human who survived each day. And if you tried living just one day in his shoes, you might be begging for Wi-Fi by lunchtime. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow, deep stories. And please tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? We're truly curious about every corner of the world you tune in from. Vikings. More than just longships, feasts, and battles. They were thousands of real lives, cold nights, wooden spoons, and hardened nerves. Today, we'll look at them without the myths, but with all the affection they deserve. Because real Vikings aren't the ones in the movies. They're the ones who smell of smoke, crackle with frost, and still rise every morning. Forget everything you thought you knew about Scandinavian minimalism. A Viking had no IKEA, no white walls, and certainly no underfloor heating. His day began with waking up in darkness. Light barely crept into the long wooden house through a hole in the roof, the only exit for smoke. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. If the wind blew the wrong way, eyes burned, throats itched, and even Odin couldn't help. The hearth was the heart of the Viking home. A fire in the middle of the room, no chimney, just a hole in the ceiling. Smoke clung to everything. Clothes, skin, bedding. Everything smelled like smoked fish. The family slept along the walls on wooden benches, everyone together, kids, adults, grandma, the dog, sometimes a goat, furs and straw instead of mattresses, maybe felt if you were lucky, nothing if not. The temperature at night, in winter, between 0 and +5 degrees. If you dared to get up and find a bathroom, you had to A. Get dressed. B. Go outside. C. Guess the direction. D. Not fall into a puddle. Because there were no toilets, just a corner in the field, and it was freezing. Plus, the neighbor's bull might think you're threatening his mate. There was no silence inside the house. Something always rustled. Someone coughed, a baby cried, the goat bleated, a cat sprang at something invisible. And someone nearby, pardon the image, passed gas. Romantic? This was a realistic version of country life, with no windows and a very low ceiling. Morning hygiene, no showers. If you were lucky, a bowl of water frozen overnight. If not, you rubbed your eyes and went to feed the pigs. Women rekindled the fire. Men fetched wood or prepared fish. Children gathered eggs, shouted, and climbed things. Breakfast? If fortune smiled, porridge with dried fish. If not, yesterday's bread, as hard as a shield. No privacy, no mirrors, no coffee. Just the sound of cracking timber and cold air stabbing your nostrils. In this world, you couldn't sleep in till 10. Life was survival. If you woke up, you were already late. The first written mention of Vikings dates back to the late 8th century, when monks from Lindisfarne, an island off northern England, recorded a terrifying sight. Plundered, slaughtered, left to the mercy of demons from the north. These were the Vikings, sailors, warriors, farmers, and raiders from the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The Viking Age lasted roughly from 790 to 1066 AD, ending with William the Conqueror's invasion of England, and the curtain fell on their reign. But despite the myths, most Vikings weren't full-time warriors. They lived in small settlements along fjords and rivers, raised animals, fished, built boats, raised children, and only occasionally sailed off to raid. Tastes of the North. Viking cuisine. Unmasked, Viking food wasn't a culinary tour of Stockholm. It was a daily battle for calories in a world where your fridge was the river and your dishwasher was your beard. They ate whatever they could catch, grow, or steal, staples, gruel made from barley or oats, bread, flat, yeastless, baked on hot stones, meat, if lucky, pig, sheep, occasionally horse. On holidays, bear, fish, daily, endlessly, herring, cod, trout, even shark, dried, smoked, boiled, vegetables, turnips, cabbage, onions, tasty, in theory. Drinks, water, beer, mead, but water could be murky or amphibian-enhanced. Meals were shared by hand from a communal pot. Spoons were scarce. Salt was luxury. Imagine 12 people silently chewing the same fish porridge mix for days. Hygiene and scent, reality, bites. Vikings did care about their appearance. Archaeologists find combs, tweezers, nail cleaners. They trimmed beards, cleaned ears, and shaped mustaches. Looked like a beast, and no skald will sing your name. But the full picture was far less fragrant. Bathing, once every few weeks. Laundry, when the season changed. Deodorant, rubbing on fat or resin. Winter, you might not undress for a month. The smell? If you stepped into a Viking longhouse, you'd probably gag. Everything around reeked of fish, sweat, wool, smoke, and the will to survive. In the world of the Vikings, there was no such thing as a spiritual life separate from the everyday. The gods were everywhere, and they weren't almighty or holy. They were human-like, just with bigger problems, longer beards, and thunderbolts. Vikings believed in a pantheon of gods who lived in Asgard. Odin, the old one-eyed god of war, poetry, and sacrifice. Thor, fierce and a bit simple, hurling hammers and summoning storms. Freya, goddess of love and death, enchanting and dangerous. Loki, cunning, deceptive, always stirring up chaos. This pantheon was like a mythological soap opera, gods arguing, fighting, reconciling, and falling out again. But unlike the distant gods of Olympus, Viking deities were close at hand. A rustle in the forest meant a spirit was near. A crack of lightning? Thor was annoyed. A raven above your home? Maybe Odin was watching. Vikings lived with the constant sense that the world was full of signs. A knock on the door wasn't just a sound, it was an omen. A dream could be prophecy. A cold wind could mean the gods were passing by. They carried rune-engraved amulets, painted symbols on shields, carved eyes on ships so they could see the way. They revered seeresses, elderly women who knew herbs, curses, and the whispering of fate. Unlike in medieval Europe, they weren't burned as witches. They were welcomed into homes to chase away misfortune. Yes, sacrifices were part of it. Sometimes animals, sometimes humans. At Uppsala in Sweden, every 10 years, they supposedly sacrificed 9 of every creature. This, according to chronicler Adam of Bremen. Whether true or not, the fear of the gods was very real. A sacrifice wasn't savagery, it was a conversation. You give something, the gods return the favor. Even death was complicated. Those who died in battle went to Valhalla, where they fought all day, feasted all night, and did it again. Others went to Freya or to hell, the underworld. The dishonored, they simply rotted. There was no eternal rest. Death was just another kind of journey. And that changed everything. Vikings feared not death itself, but dying without glory. The image of Vikings as nothing but raiders and slashers is convenient and shallow. The truth is much richer. A Viking was a working man, and only sometimes a warrior. Every boy in a Norse village learned early to dig, chop, haul, build, fish, sow, dry, salt. The land wasn't fertile. Growing grain meant breaking rock. Firewood had to be chopped, carried, dried. Fish, caught, gutted, dried. Everything was done by hand. Calluses like shields. Women did no less, spinning, brewing, cooking, weaving, drying herbs, all without modern comfort over smoky fires in drafty homes. Why were Vikings feared? Because they didn't just fight, they enjoyed it. A boy got his first knife at 8. By 10, he was learning sword play. At 12, archery. By 15, he was out at sea. Fighting wasn't art. It was routine. Their shield wall, the boar's head formation, was brutally efficient, like a medieval tank. Swords were luxury items. A good blade cost as much as a modern Ferrari. Most men carried axes, spears, or knives. But if you had a sword, it meant you were rich or lucky or had killed someone who was. These swords had names. They were passed down, inscribed with runes, and always sharp as frost. To be a warrior didn't mean being a thug. It meant seeking glory, to have your name sung in sagas long after you were gone. A fight wasn't just a fight. It was a performance. Cowards were despised, liars too. You could kill an enemy, but no cruelty. You might meet again in Valhalla. Egil, warrior, poet, killer, philosopher, born in Iceland around 910 A.D. At 6, he killed a boy during a game for insulting him. At 12, he was raiding, but he was feared and heard. Egil had a sword and words. The saga of Egil tells of the time he saved his life with a poem. Captured by King Eirik, Egil was set to be executed, but overnight he composed a praise poem, Head Ransom, comparing himself to ancient heroes, praising battle and the king. The next morning, the king spared his life. That's the Viking spirit. One hand with a sword, the other with runes. The ability to kill and the gift to make it poetry. There is no symbol more powerful in Viking history than the drakkar, the long, narrow ship with a dragon's head. But it wasn't just transportation. It was the embodiment of the people's spirit, their passport, their vehicle, their home, their temple, even their coffin. Viking ships were handcrafted from oak. Only the best trees were chosen. The hull was flexible yet strong, built from overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets. These ships could sail both seas and rivers. With their shallow draft, they could land almost anywhere, even on a beach. A Viking ship could be hauled over land if needed. No luxuries on board, just shields lining the sides, a chest, a sail, oars, and sometimes the bones of its former owner. Ships were passed down through generations. Even in the 9th century, Vikings reached Iceland, Greenland, the coasts of France, Spain, Morocco, even North America. Yes, Leif Erikson is considered the first European to set foot in Vinland, now Canada, around 500 years before Columbus. The sails, made of wool, square, often died. When there was no wind, they rowed. Everyone rowed, no row, no meal. They slept on wooden planks wrapped in animal skins. When a ship was built, chants and blessings were sung. Before a raid, prayers were said. When someone died, they might be burned inside the ship with all their belongings. It was the final voyage to the sea, to fire, to glory. Now imagine this from the shore, fog, silence, and suddenly a dragon's head appears. A red sail fills the sky, and a haunting chant echoes. No army struck fear like 10 Viking ships on your horizon. They were fast, silent, mobile, true sea phantoms. In September of the year 999 or 1000 AD, one of the largest naval battles of the Viking Age unfolded in the western Baltic Sea, the Battle of Svolder. It was a clash between the combined fleets of 3 rulers, King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, King Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden, and the Norwegian Earl Eirik Håkonarson, against the fleet of a single man, King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway. Olaf was at sea with only 11 ships, including his famous longship, the Long Serpent. Surrounding him were an estimated 70 ships from the coalition of rival kings. Though outnumbered, Olaf arranged his vessels in a defensive line and managed to hold off attackers at first. But the enemy used a chain assault strategy, overwhelming his ships one by one. Eventually, Olaf's allies were dead, captured, or routed. Only the Long Serpent remained, holding firm. According to saga accounts, Olaf, refusing to be taken alive, threw himself into the sea, a gesture of honor rather than defeat. Why it mattered. Olaf had been aggressively promoting Christianity in Norway, but with his death, that process stalled. Norway was divided and fell under the control of Danish and Swedish powers and local earls. The defeat marked the end of Olaf's royal reign and shifted the balance of power in Scandinavia. The Battle of Svolder stands as a striking example of Viking naval strategy, brutal political rivalry, and legendary heroism. It also reminds us how the sea was not just a trade route. It was a battlefield where kings rose and fell. Drop a modern person into the daily life of a Viking, and they'd last maybe 6 hours at best. Because being a Viking wasn't just glory and battles, it was a brutal, comfortless routine. Cold, unrelenting. Average winter temperatures in Scandinavia hovered between 5 to 15 degrees, 23 to 5 degrees. Indoors, no insulation, no glass windows, a dirt floor. The fire pit, smoky and temperamental. Smoke didn't vent. It lingered. Everything smelled like jerky. Clothing, wool, leather, fur. But no thermal underwear. Nighttime meant lying on a wooden bench covered in furs, praying your toes wouldn't freeze off. Food? Humble. Morning, barley porridge, sometimes with straw. Lunch, salted fish. Dinner, the same, just colder. Occasionally, dried meat, cabbage, bark bread. Alcohol? Yes. Light beer, homemade and smoky. Mead, sweet and potent. But everything spoiled quickly. When winter came, hunger followed. Hygiene, better than you'd expect. Vikings weren't filthy savages. They bathed once a week, in a bathhouse, if available, in rivers or lakes, if not frozen. They combed their hair and beards. Anglo-Saxon sources found this annoyingly fashionable. But toilets? That's another story. Just a bucket and fresh air. Sleep? Crowded. Everyone slept together, on benches, on the floor, fully clothed, under furs, with kids, animals snoring, drafts, and body odors. The alarm clock, a cow with indigestion, home life, or survival test, lamps, clay bowls with fat and wicks, music, singing, entertainment, storytelling. Life wasn't cozy, soft, or stylish, but it had resilience. People survived, laughed, prayed, loved, and survived again. A Viking wasn't a hero. He was a survivor. Who ruled the Vikings? A king? A chieftain? The gods? The truth is, not always, and not everywhere. Scandinavian society in the 8th to 11th centuries had a complex, surprisingly democratic system of governance. One of the main institutions was the Thing, an assembly of all free men in the community. They gathered several times a year to settle disputes, make decisions, and elect leaders. The Thing could declare war, demand accountability from a leader, settle land conflicts, exile criminals or enemies. It was a form of direct democracy where every free man had a voice, excluding women and slaves. In medieval Iceland, this was the highest authority, a proto-parliament before the word even existed. There were kings, especially in Norway and Denmark, but their power was not absolute, dependent on tribal loyalty, limited by the Thing. A king could be deposed if he was unjust. Vikings weren't blindly obedient. They respected strength, but more so wisdom and honor. Women didn't have a vote in the Thing, but held influence in the household, managed estates, owned land, could divorce a husband if he was dishonorable or drunk. Archaeological finds show that women played important roles in Viking society, far beyond just being wives. Vikings had slaves, thralls. They were mostly captured in raids. Thralls did labor and had little to no rights, though some were eventually freed and even granted land. It wasn't a slave empire, but slavery was part of reality. So Viking governance was a blend of leadership, assemblies, strength, negotiation, and tradition. They weren't democratic by modern standards, but they were far from tyrannical. The Vikings are long gone. Their sagas have fallen silent in the snow, their swords rusted, their ships decayed. Yet somehow, when we hear the word Viking, something stirs inside us. Why do we still remember them? Because Vikings are not just history, they're an archetype. They symbolize independence, strength, willpower, the quest for limits. They didn't wait for permission. They raised their sails when others stayed ashore. They knew fear and still moved forward. More than barbarians, yes, they raided, they looted, but they also traded, founded settlements, acted as diplomats and craftsmen, composed poems that still survive. They had laws, customs, a sense of honor. They could kill, but didn't torture. They could lose, but never whined. What do they leave us? We live in an age of comfort, speed, and algorithms. But sometimes we lack the simple things: to face the wind, to look at the horizon, to make a decision without asking for permission. Vikings weren't magicians, but they knew their strength and followed through. This isn't a fairy tale, it's memory, a reminder that even in the coldest wind, a person can still be truly human. Though the Vikings are long gone, something of them still lingers in us. When we search for ourselves in a new city, when we dare to change jobs, break a toxic cycle, say enough, that's the little Viking inside us. He's not always bearded and armed. Sometimes he wears a suit, sometimes pajamas. Sometimes he sails oceans, sometimes his own fears. But above all, he moves forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the mists of the North. If you enjoy slow, deep storytelling like this, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what struck you the most. That matters to us. Because even in the 21st century, somewhere inside each of us, the wind of Scandinavia still whispers,